So let me start out by asking you a question. Are you being faithful this morning? Are you being faithful? Now, what came to mind when you heard that question? Some it might be faithfulness in marriage. Are you being loyal to your husband or your wife and to the commitments and vows you made to each other? Or are you being faithful to do what you're supposed to be doing at work or at home, at school, or at church? Are you being faithful to what God wants you to be and to do? Now, what do we mean by being faithful? The word itself shows that it means being full of faith or keeping faith. Keeping a trust or confidence. It means loyalty. It means doing your duty, carrying out your responsibilities. It indicates someone who is constant and reliable. So being faithful is a good thing. It's something we should desire of ourselves, and it's something the Lord requires of us. But often, when we think of someone who's faithful, what kind of a picture do we come up with? The stability and constancy and loyalty of such a person often can translate into a picture of a person who maybe doesn't change much, a person who might be very predictable, someone whom many might classify as even being rather dull and boring, not very adventurous, not having much excitement in life, not taking many risks. We may even picture a person who may not seem to accomplish a whole lot, but he or she is always there, hanging in there, sticking with it, never giving up. Day after day, they keep working at it. So even if they don't accomplish much, if nothing else, we can commend them for being so faithful. We need to be careful, or we can start associating the ideas of being unchanging, dull, not taking risk, and being unproductive with that quality of being faithful. Being faithful can become to be looked at as almost, a negative or an undesirable quality. And that's certainly not the picture the Bible gives us of faithfulness at all. Jesus often used stories, as you know, called parables to get across the truth to people. And in one of his better known parables, he shows, among other things, what it means to be faithful. So let's look at Matthew chapter 25, and read this parable together. Matthew 25, beginning at verse 14. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them, and made another 5 talents. And likewise he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground, and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He also, who had received 2 talents, came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid, and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So here's a story about a man and his 3 servants. And this man was leaving on an extended trip out of the country and entrusted these 3 servants with his possessions. He gave each of them a certain amount of talents. Now, a talent was a measurement of weight. So you could have a talent of gold or a talent of silver or some other precious metal or coin. So he gave one servant 5 talents, another 2, and another 1. Well, after a long period of time, the man came back. And 2 of the servants had traded with and ended up doubling the talents that had been entrusted with them, that they had been entrusted with. The other servant had just hung on to what he'd been given. And the 2, they were commended for being what? Faithful servants. The 1 was condemned for being a wicked and lazy servant. So what does this tell us about what it means to be faithful? Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Do the 2 faithful servants fit that picture we talked about earlier of being unchanging, unwilling to take risks, unproductive? No. It's the wicked and lazy servant who comes closer to fitting that picture, isn't it? So right away, we see that the picture that some people have of a faithful person, some of those ideas that they associate with faithfulness don't fit with the biblical picture of a faithful person. So let's take a little closer look at these servants. The 2 faithful servants made use of what their master had given them. They tried to do something with it. They tried to accomplish something with it. They weren't satisfied with just the status quo, so to speak, because they knew their master wouldn't be satisfied with them just hanging on to what they'd been given. They didn't do like the one servant did. He hid what he had been given and didn't do anything with it. Notice, he didn't lose it. He took care of it. He was concerned about this thing that his master had given him. And it indicates that he had thought long and hard about the kind of person his master was. He thought about how awful it would be to lose this thing that had been entrusted to him. He probably worried about it, lost sleep over it. He searched for the safest place that he could think of to bury it. And I imagine he probably watched over that spot of ground where he had buried it like a hawk to make sure nothing happened to that talent he had been entrusted with. He kept watch over it for a long time until his master returned. And he was probably relieved to dig it up and find it still there and to be able to get it back into the hands of his master. Now, a lot of people might refer to that servant as having been faithful, but not the Lord. He says he was wicked and lazy. Now, what does that reveal? That the Lord considers faithful the ones who try to make use of what he's given them, not just those who hang on to what he's given them. So again, let's go back to our question. Are you being faithful? Now, are we making use of the things God has given us and has entrusted us with? Everything that we have belongs to him. We should look at everything as that with which he has entrusted us. He's entrusted you with the possessions that you have, with the family, children, grandchildren that you have, with the money and the resources that you have. He's entrusted you with certain abilities and skills. He's entrusted you with certain knowledge. He's entrusted you with a certain amount of time. He's entrusted you with a life, a soul. What are we doing with those things he's given us? Are we trying to use them in the way our master would want us to? The tragedy is not in trying and failing. The tragedy is in not trying at all. The one servant was condemned, not because he lost the talent, because he didn't, did he? But it was because he did nothing with it. He just hid it. Now the Lord gives different people different things, as this parable shows. Now he entrusts some with 5 talents, some with 2, some with 1. He doesn't give everybody the same amount or the same thing. But how much he gives us in abilities, resources, and other things doesn't really matter. What matters is, what are we doing with what he has given us? No matter how much or how little, what are we doing with what he has given us? Are we trying to put it to use, doing what we can with what the Lord has put in our hands? Or are we hiding it? Now, the Lord has entrusted us with these things not just so we can hide them in a safety deposit box, like an old coin collection we might have that we get out every once in a while to look at and admire, or maybe check out its current value and then put it back again safe and sound. But rather, he expects us to use what he's given us. Use what the Lord's given you, big or small, for his glory. So being faithful doesn't just mean hanging on to or keeping what he's given us. It means using it. Now there's another thing that you'll notice about the 2 faithful servants. They are the risk takers in this parable. They risked losing what their master had given them. They took the talents they were given and they traded, they invested them. It says that they traded with them. Now, we don't know exactly what it involved, but it seems that they put the money into some kind of trade or business. That was how they put it to use. They could have lost that investment. They could have come out on the short end of the trade, although I'm sure they were careful about what they did, and they did it wisely. But they were willing to risk it. They knew that their master wanted them to accomplish as much as they could with what they had been given. But the one servant, he wasn't willing to take that risk. He wasn't even willing to risk putting it in the bank and letting it draw interest. He testifies clearly as to the reason why. In verse 25, he says, I was afraid. I was afraid. He was afraid to take the risk. He was afraid of losing that talent. He was afraid of failure. There's a verse in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, it's verse 4, that says, He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. And it's using farmers' terminology there to describe someone not willing to go out into the field and work because of a little wind or because of a few clouds, the risk that there might be bad weather. One paraphrase of that verse says, if you wait for perfect conditions, you will never get anything done. If you wait for perfect conditions, you will never get anything done. The one servant, fearful of what might happen, didn't get anything done with what his master had given him. He was too afraid to try. He was afraid to take any risk. Now, I'm not a big proponent of risk-taking, at least not concerning a lot of things in life. I tend to like the sure thing, or at least the less risky of options. And I'm very aware of the dangers that are involved in some risky activities and decisions. But being faithful often involves a willingness to take a risk of sorts. The 2 servants were risking what their master had entrusted them with. Yet, as we find out later from the master's reaction to the other servant, the bigger risk would have been in doing nothing, because then they would have been risking their master's favor. They were willing to risk their talents only because they knew that it was what their master expected them to do. They knew that their master would not condemn them if they tried and lost the talents, but that he would condemn them if they did nothing. And that's the case with us too, and with the things God's entrusted us with. The real risk is in letting fear of failure keep us from doing what we know our master wants us to do. And that's one way faith comes into this idea of being faithful. If we're assured of what the Lord's will is, what it is that he wants us to do with this life and this soul and these resources and abilities that he's entrusted us with, if we're assured of what he wants, what his will is, then we're willing to follow through, trusting him to guide and to provide. It's the kind of faith that believes that saying, wherever God guides, he provides. You've heard that? Wherever God guides, he provides. Someone said, if you insist on solving all the problems before you make a decision, you'll never know the thrill of living by faith. Now, living by faith doesn't mean taking wild risks and unfounded leaps of faith, so to speak. But it means following where the Master leads, doing what he wants you to do, using what he's entrusted you with in the ways he calls you to, and not letting fear of failure or of rejection or being laughed at or fear of the unknown or anything else keep you from doing the Master's will. So being faithful may mean being willing to take some risk in order to do the Lord's will and in order to accomplish some things with what he's given you. So let's go back to our original question. Are you being faithful? Are you being a good and faithful servant of the Lord? Just as the master in the parable returned one day to settle accounts with his servants, one day we're going to have to give an accounting to the Lord regarding all those things that he's entrusted to our care, whether it's a soul, our children, our resources, our possessions, our time, the gospel itself, other things. Will he find that we've been faithful? What are you doing with what God's given you? Now, are we just holding tight to them, enjoying them, finding comfort in knowing that we possess them? Or are we truly being faithful and trying to use them in ways that will bear fruit for glory of God? Are we letting fear keep us from doing all that the Lord wants us to do with those things? Afraid of the risks? Afraid to live by faith? Or are we willing to step out in faith and follow what the Lord wants us to do with our lives, with our talents, our finances, the gospel, regardless of other risks involved? Let's make sure we're truly being faithful servants, making the most of what the Lord's given us, using it for his glory and to produce fruit for his kingdom, and not afraid to follow wherever he leads. Maybe there's someone listening this morning to whom the Lord is speaking about an ability or skill that he wants you to quit hiding and start using for him. Some resources he wants you to let him use, or a life or a soul that he wants you to submit to him and to his will. Maybe the Lord's talking to you about not holding back out of fear, but to have faith, to trust him enough to be willing to step out and take some risk in order to do his will. If the Lord's speaking to you this morning, maybe we all need to just pray this prayer together as we come to the close of this message. So let's pray this prayer together. Lord, starting right now, I'm going to let you have your way with my life and with everything you've entrusted me with. Use me and use what you've given me for your glory. I want to be faithful. Amen.